We're back. Okay, so what I want you guys to understand about Bacon's Rebellion is it's portrayed as this real sort of populist, grassroots, a man leading the backcountry farmers against the governor of Berkeley in Jamestown. It's nothing of the sort. It's led by Nathaniel Bacon, who was himself an aristocrat who had been kept out of sort of the Jamestown gentry and was bitter about it. So the basis of this rebellion is you've got white-red conflict out in the frontier. You've got whites who are being attacked by Native Americans, and the Governor Berkeley, won't do anything about it because he's got a really lucrative fur trade out in the frontier. So as a result, Nathaniel Bacon and a bunch of former indentured servants are going to come in. They're going to attack Jamestown. It's going to work, and then he's going to die. Okay? It's a little more complicated than that, but the story that we want to know is, at the end of the day, a major change happens. People start to wonder, should we be having all of these single, angry, white dudes out on the frontier who are going to cause problems, or should we look for a different labor supply? So as a result of Bacon's Rebellion, you're going to see a shift, not immediately, but in the 1680s, 1690s, to more of African labor. Okay, that's the change. We've had Africans, again, since 1619, but it's really going to change in the 1680s. So if you ever get a question about what Bacon's Rebellion represents, it really is that change in labor. Okay, so we want to now shift north to New England, and I know that we've sort of told this story from 1607 into the 1670s. Now we're going to backtrack, but it's helpful to understand Virginia before we understand New England. Very, very important for us to understand that there are two places that people come. Plymouth, much more insignificant, and then Mass Bay, which is going to be far more significant. But the big deal here with Plymouth is these are the hardcore Puritans. These are your separatists. These are people who want nothing to do with the Church of England, for the reason that the Church of England has stayed way too Catholic for their tastes. So they leave England and they go to Holland, because they're looking for a place that they can actually worship freely. They find that Holland is too secular. They actually worry that their children are Dutchified, as they say. So then they head off to the New World. So they're going to end up in Plymouth, and they're going to really do their own thing under William Bradford. It's a name that you probably don't necessarily need to know, but William Bradford is to Plymouth as John Winthrop is to Mass Bay. Sort of two important guys in the development of New England. Of course, as kids, you guys learned about the Mayflower Compact. It's not terribly important overall, except to get the understanding that because they went off course and they ended up out of where their charter should be, they had to come together and form some sort of self-government. And it's a symbol of self-government, but it's not a constitution in any way. In fact, our first constitution is somewhere else in New England. That's actually with Thomas Hooker in Connecticut, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. If you see that anywhere on a test, it would likely be a distractor and not the answer itself. Okay? But Plymouth is rather small overall. We have the first Thanksgiving, but it's going to be swallowed up by Mass Bay. Mass Bay you need to know, because Mass Bay is, at least in my mind, the most important idea that we will see throughout American history. From the beginning all the way to today, we function based on the idea that John Winthrop said, a city on a hill. We are going to be an exemplar to the world. Everything we do is going to be seen by everyone else, and we want to be that example. So if you think about our foreign policy, pretty much throughout history, it's predicated on this: we are special. We are this shining example. Except you got a problem with this shining example. Despite the fact that you're going to have over 20,000 people come in the first of the Great Migrations, the second Great Migration will be African Americans moving from the south to the north, essentially from pre-World War I all the way to World War II. Your problem with this city on a hill is that it's incredibly repressive, okay? So repressive that people leave. And they go other places, particularly like Rhode Island, because they won't allow people to essentially worship freely, i.e. Quakers, i.e. Jews, i.e. anybody that isn't part of the Congregationalist Puritan church. The first guy to leave is Thomas Hooker. He goes to Connecticut, not terribly important, except for this idea of the Fundamental Orders, First Constitution. These two folks you should always know together. Roger Williams and Hutchinson, Roger Williams. They are the two famous dissenters, both of whom sort of looked John Winthrop in the eye and said, we don't like what's going on. In the first case, with Roger Williams, who was himself a preacher, he said, I don't like what you've done with the Native Americans, and I don't like what you've done with this lack of separation between church and state. It really appears that church and state are so enmeshed that we've got essentially a theocracy, a very important term in terms of thinking about religion and government essentially one and the same. Now, he goes to Rhode Island, and Hutchinson follows. And Hutchinson is dangerous. Dangerous to the patriarchy of New England, because she's a woman who knows her Bible, and she's a woman who questions the religious establishment, essentially saying, according to my belief in antinomianism, you don't need to actually have anybody to intercede between you and God, okay, because of predestination. You can have your own relationship with God. No one liked that, and they especially didn't like that when she was brought in front of the court, she said, I communicate with God. Essentially, for that heresy and for showing up the establishment, i.e., John Winthrop, she's banished. Now, she heads off and ends up in Rhode Island and is killed by Indians, and John Winthrop, sort of still bitter, says basically karma's a bee. And he really did say something to that effect, like, well, she got what she deserved. And you're like, wow, you started New England, great. Okay, so you've got Anne Hutchinson, Roger Williams, two very important names. Now, important for us to realize what life in New England is like. And you say, this is culture, this is kind of culture that I really didn't like in chapter 3 or 4 to begin with. But it's very important, at least for my class, who've got a question on this for our review. How is New England different? New England is very, very strong on education. It's very strong on education because of religion. They've got to train men to become ministers. That's where you're actually going to see Harvard and Yale, Harvard being the oldest college in the United States. The second oldest college is William and Mary, okay? Much to the chagrin of Yale, who probably thinks that they should be, 1 and 1A in every question that involves Harvard, okay? But girls also learn to read. Very, very important. An additional element here is the fact that there are girls. Because if you remember in the Chesapeake, very, very male-heavy. And that's going to create plenty of problems with a lack of community. You're also going to see this New England town meeting. More than anything, this is the closest we ever come to direct democracy. That means people are involved in the everyday decisions of their town. Now, it's not everybody, though. It's only people that are members of the church, and since the religious leaders choose who's a member of the church, the religious leaders have de facto power, political power. Do you guys understand that? If religious leaders choose who's a member of the church, and only people in the church can vote, they have far more power than perhaps someone would think in a separation of church and state, okay? But this idea of direct democracy is something that we in America really don't have. We elect people to represent us. That is a model that we have used. The closest we ever come to direct democracy would be the New England town meeting, okay? And again, like we had in the Chesapeake, we have problems with the Native Americans, except it's easier in New England because disease has wiped many of them out prior to our arrival. That's not to say that we don't actually have wars, though. We have the Pequot War, and we also have King Philip's War. King Philip also went by the name Metacom, and this is a pretty brutal war. Going on for a good 3 years, the Native Americans had the upper hand for a while. And what I want you to understand about King Philip's War is a trend that you're going to see. When Native Americans feel that they don't have any more options, they get together with other Native Americans in sort of pan-Indian confederacies. We're going to see this with Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh. We're going to see this later on with the Native Americans on the plains. It's an idea that when we think we're going to be defeated, we're all going to come together. And this is essentially the end of Native Americans in New England, much as the Second Anglo-Potent War erased any real power for the Native Americans in the Chesapeake. Let me try to remember. Native Americans lose because they are disorganized, disposable, and I'll come up with the other third D that I should have remembered. Okay? So, the new southern colonies. I don't really need you to remember much about North Carolina, except it's very, very different than South Carolina. South Carolina is aristocratic. South Carolina has Charleston, at the time called Charlestown. That is the only city of any relevance in the South whatsoever. No offense to anybody who's from the South. Atlanta is not important yet. Charleston is the only city. And even then, it's not much of a city per se. It's a remarkable port. The people in North Carolina are squatters who came down from Virginia. Serious, serious antipathy between the North and the South, so much so that you're going to get sort of your Scots-Irish, Andrew Jacksonian badasses that come from the north, and you're going to get much more of your aristocratic folks that come from the south. Okay? Georgia, not terribly important except for a few bits of information. It's a buffer between essentially South Carolina and dangerous Spanish Florida. It's also a debtor's colony, and it does allow a bit of religious freedom in Savannah, much as we also saw in Charleston. So if you're thinking of sort of places in the South that allowed for religious freedom, the entire South allows for more religious freedom than New England because they care more about money than they actually do about religion itself. But those are particularly tolerant places, as you would expect, in more of a commercial cosmopolitan area, Savannah in Georgia and Charleston in South Carolina. Now, randomly, I sort of jumped from New England down to the South. Now I'm going to go back to the middle colonies. If you're anything like the students in my class, you forget the middle colonies. You remember sort of New England, and you remember the South, and you may remember the Chesapeake as Virginia and Maryland. You forget the middle colonies. The middle colonies, the two sort of key middle colonies, are New York and Pennsylvania. New Jersey would like to be included in there, and Delaware is always sort of the odd colony out, but sometimes it's included there. The Quakers are important because they're different. They're not your Anglicans, as you see in the Chesapeake. They're not your Puritans, as you see in New England. They're different in that they believe that they can communicate with God. Sort of like Ann Hutchinson was talking about antinomianism, except this is sort of entire faith, okay? They're simple in terms of their meetings. Everybody's got to come to consensus. And they allow women to have power, which, again, was very, very different than any other faith in the United States at the time. They were kicked out of New England and went to Rhode Island, but they're going to find a real safe haven in this City of Brotherly Love by William Penn. It's important to understand that they're going to draw in a bunch of Germanic elements, as well as groups that we now associate with Pennsylvania, like the Amish and sort of the Amish with some electricity, the Mennonites, okay? So generally speaking, what we want to remember about Pennsylvania is kind to Native Americans, tolerant of religions, and pacifists, and then very, very important, also going to be the leaders in abolition. Okay, so we're going to see sort of the first anti-slavery societies come out of Pennsylvania. So when you're thinking about progressive, you want to think about Pennsylvania, and obviously Rhode Island was as well very, very tolerant in terms of religion. Okay, now Maryland is interesting. Maryland's a lot like Virginia in terms of what they grow. They grow tobacco, they have indentured servants, and then they're going to have slaves. But what I want you to understand is it's different. It's the only place with Catholics. And your book does a terrible job of representing this. But Lord Calvert, okay, who's going to be Lord Baltimore, this is an economic opportunity for him just as much as it's religious asylum. So what he does is he brings in all of his Catholic friends. But you can't populate all of Maryland with Catholics because there aren't enough. So you've got to bring in Protestants as well, because again, this was an economic venture as much as it was a religious one. So all of a sudden you have a tension between the rich Catholic minority and the poor Protestant majority. And when it looks like the Protestants are actually going to overrun the Catholics, you get the first major act of religious toleration, okay? Often known as the Act of Toleration. It's got a sort of more technical name. But if you ever see that on the AP test, or you're ever writing about anything related to the colonies and religion, Maryland is a great example of toleration, but it's not real toleration. It's Savior took us toleration. It's, okay, we'll allow you to coexist with us only because we're afraid that you'll overpower us. And that's different toleration than you're going to see in a place like Pennsylvania or Rhode Island, but it actually has the name, an act of toleration, so people think it's tolerant. Okay? Now, when you're thinking about the economy, which is a major difference between New England and the South, you're going to realize that they did farm. It's not like all of a sudden they were only doing commercial, but they were small farms because the soil was rocky. So they had something called subsistence farming. Subsistence farming means you can only sort of grow what you need for your family. You're not doing this in any way commercially. You're not selling it. Okay? So very important, farming in New England is small farming. Farming in Pennsylvania, in New York, is a major business. That is the early breadbasket of the United States, even before it's the United States, obviously, the colonies. Later on, of course, with bonanza farming in sort of 1870s, 1880s, and big reapers that we're going to see later on, it's going to move towards the plains. But farming there, small farms, big grain farms, okay? The North is going to be rich in natural resources. That's why they're going to become major shipbuilders. In addition, of course, they're right on the water, so you're going to find fishing, shipbuilding, major